Hello, everyone, and thank you again for joining us. My name is Alejandro Acosta. I am Equality Florida's HIV Advocacy Coordinator. You are joining us today in our second of our three-part series called Unlocking HIV Stigma. If you joined us yesterday, you saw that we were joined by advocates, and we spoke about HIV criminalization and the intersections that HIV stigma has there. We had Senator Jason Pizzo, our own John Harris Maurer, who's our public policy director. We also had Aisha Scott and Donna Sabatino. I recommend that if you have not seen those, you can go to our Equality Florida Facebook page and check that out. Today, we are going to be joined by another set of speakers. The reason why we're doing these conversations is because stigma, it continues to be rampant, especially in the state of Florida. It is incredible that 40 years after HIV, we are still dealing with misinformation and with stigma, which really fuels public perception. We know also that our trans brothers and sisters have been under attack this year by, it's what it seems, everyone. Unfortunately, when we add HIV to that mix, I think that it can be explosive. I am going to be talking to my guests about stigma within the community and what are the roadblocks that are preventing the movement and really just the elimination of HIV stigma, especially in the trans community. I am going to exhort you guys that if you're logging in with us to ask any questions or comments in our live feed, you can also share this with all of your networks. I'm sorry, it's a little cold here today and I've been flustered all day. So share this with your networks, share with your friends. This is meant to be a conversation, so it can go anywhere. And we're gonna do this with respect. And of course, with the great people, the great leaders that we have today, I can expect nothing less. So first, we are going to have, I'm gonna introduce all the panelists, and they are going to introduce themselves, a little bit about what work they're doing, so that you guys can figure out and see what wonderful work is happening down here in South Florida. So without further ado, I am going to introduce my first guest, Ariana Lynde. Ariana, thank you so much for joining us. Can you briefly introduce yourself, who you are, what you do, and where you're joining us from?
Alejandro, first of all, thank you so much to you and the great work you're doing with Equality Florida. Thank you for inviting me. I am one of the transgender activists, actually openly living with the HIV, and I'm running one organization called Ariana Center, who educate, empower, and give leadership to a transgender community in South Florida and Puerto Rico right now.
Thank you so much. And you are also Peruvian and a wonderful Latinx and immigration advocate on top of being an HIV advocate. So thank you so much for joining us, Ariana. Our second guest today comes from South Florida. It is an amazing advocate, and I'm going to give her an opportunity to introduce herself. We just welcome Miss Brielle Roundtree.
Hello, my name is Brielle Roundtree. My pronouns are she, her. I am the founder of Bridging the Gap Book Club, which centers queer and trans people of Florida here in South Florida. And also I am newly hired at Trans Lifeline as the domestic and intimate partner violence coordinator. So
thank you so much for joining us too, Brielle.
Hello, Ariana.
Thank you so much. Our third guest today runs it out. We really wanted to make sure that we had some trans masculine or some trans men as part of this conversation. So I'm welcoming and very thankful to have him here. Jace Roach is our third guest.
Hi, how's it going? Thank you for having me. I'm the executive director of Bridging the Gap Book Club that centers queer and trans folks of color. I've been doing work in the community for the past 3 years here in South Florida. I'm originally from Philadelphia area, Delaware. I'm a recent transplant, so I've been kind of immersed into the community and trying to bring visibility to trans masculine folks and issues that are targeted towards us that are largely invisible.
And again, thank you so much for being here. Part of the challenges of actually having this panel was finding a trans man who would be either openly living with HIV or available. So I really, again, thank you for being here. And it just speaks to the need for, like you said, this visibility. And I want to also make a distinction today that not all our panelists are living with HIV. Ariana identifies as someone living with HIV, but our other two panelists are advocates and people who are working in the community who can give and speak about the experiences of the need of trans intervention when it comes to HIV down here in South Florida and in Florida overall. So speaking of that, I'm going to start with you, Ariana. Ariana, when we talk about trans issues of HIV here in Florida, what is the state of trans issues here in Florida?
I think, and thank you for telling before, I am openly living with HIV. I am a worldwide ambassador, a speak person for the campaign You Equal You. It's a worldwide campaign to describe a person who they are living with HIV and they are maintaining in viral loss undetectable for long time and have a commitment with the doctors and adherence. It's impossible to transmit the virus, the HIV virus. It's a part of the prevention, and it's a part of my life too, because as a openly person living with HIV, I know how hard it is living and get services over here in South Florida, right? And specific people they are targeting and say, just because we are transgender, that is what we deserve sometimes. And sometimes some transgender, they believe that because the society and the community push you to there. But I know right now when I'm serving and I have my organization, I know a major of the percentage of my community, they are negative, don't have access to PrEP, what is very important, right? To don't get. I think they have a different perspective, and it's so. I think what happened in South Florida is, even though South Florida is one of the gay cities or gay regions worldwide, right? Even in the gay community, we don't have that powerful. And when people they have a power to provide, to give us a leadership, right? So I think that's why maybe it's different, the history of a transgender living in South Florida or in Fort Lauderdale as a transgender living in maybe New York or San Francisco or Los Angeles, who they have a more access, even though they still have a needs, they have a more resources and more people open and willing to helping grassroots transgender agencies and leaders, because we are a community where it's a little, not say difficult, but it's a community what we are as a transgender, we can only understand other transgender. And this is the magic, powerful leadership what transgender have with the transgender community. You know, that connection, transgender with a transgender, make that connection stronger to linkage to care, to maintain people in care, or to apply for advocacy or leadership. If we're talking in the whole grants, people talking about meaningful involvement, but I am the only, right, meaningful involvement, and I am the only one transgender woman openly living with HIV who they are involved in the policies for transgender openly, right, for that one. So I think that is one of the, we have to work, and also in the stigma, because in transgender you can be a transgender, but you cannot be transgender positive, because you can have a more difficult life or more difficult. And that's why I think that's why I create that awareness in me, that power to say, yes, I am positive, I can live one life. You know, I think I have a little little life more happy than other transgender and brothers, you know. So that's what I have to use that things and say, listen, I can live healthy, I can break that stigma and that thing.
Thank you so much, Ariana. One of the issues that we have here in Florida when it comes to transgender HIV is that we do not have data that is available to the public to report on the cases of HIV in the transgender community. And that certainly is an issue, is because it's especially what you're saying, right? We have no idea what the numbers are, and it's very hard for anyone in general to be openly living with HIV. And again, when we add that to the transgender experience, Brielle, you've been working on prevention and around the transgender community. How is the topic of HIV spoken about in private? I mean, Ariana is telling us here that it seems like there's a double stigma, right? You can be transgender, but being transgender and living with HIV, wow. I mean, what are those conversations like?
For me, it's a very taboo subject. It's not something that we typically like to discuss because, in my experience, we're not just trans, right? We're not just trans and positive, but to be trans, to be Black and positive, the dynamics of what that is in society. So for me, it's just a lack of resources, a lack of education, a lack of access. We don't really typically have those conversations just because we want to remain unknown, unseen. In some spaces, we deem that safe. Because we know as African American trans people, our lives, our visibility is costly, sometimes deadly. So very taboo. It's not a conversation that we like to have or confront. I have to be honest and tell you that it was even hard for me to want to partake in the panel just because of that reason. So stigma is real,
No,
and it needs to be addressed.
I agree. Again, part of the challenges to finding people living with HIV for this panel is because there's not a lot of trans advocates out there who want to be identified with the HIV cause. And that in itself is part of the problem that we're having right now.
Agreed.
And when you're saying that we don't speak about it and that it's taboo, I mean, again, when we think about stigma and how it has been able to survive for this long is because of silence. And because of fear that association with anything HIV is going to bring negative things to our world. So I totally appreciate you being here.
And that's exactly why I wanted to have the conversation, because HIV has affected so many people in my life, friends, family members. And I thank Ariana for her transparency and vulnerability, because it's not an easy thing to do, to be open and to share that experience. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And we love Ariana. Ariana is, again, a powerful warrior because she's going against every odds. She's an immigrant, right? She's trans. She's living with HIV. I mean, Jace, when we think about also how HIV affects and kind of like infiltrates itself into the transmasculine experience, a lot of people dismiss, like you said earlier, the transmasculine experience because for a lot of people, you guys are invisible. How is HIV? How you guys deal with that?
I think a part of the issue is, even from a scientific standpoint, it's not much research done on HIV and how it's transmitted, and PrEP, for example, on people with female reproductive systems, or vaginas to be more explicit. A lot of that data is not there. And a lot of times we don't see ourselves reflected even in PrEP commercials. Also, when you talk about the stigma of HIV still being considered, a homosexual or gay man's disease, if I am a straight or heterosexual trans man, I don't want to necessarily be equated being a gay man or being a woman, right? So I think a lot of those stigma compacts itself, or then to have another conversation of how you have sex. I think that also is a very taboo subject for transmasculine individuals. Like, um, if you are having sex penetratively, like, what does that look like for you? What does that questioning bring from other people? Like, well, why'd you transition if you're still, gonna have sex in that way? It is really compacted as far as the stigma goes. And to be honest, if I go to the doctor outside of Whitlam Manor, no one even asks me these questions because I am heterosexual. Like, I don't I don't check these boxes that people think of they associate with HIV. So like it's not even a question if I'm outside of will manner, to be completely honest.
You know, it's incredible because I go back to what Ariana said earlier, right? In South Florida here, we have, in Florida overall, we don't have the access to so many services as many other cities. But think about if we're here in South Florida, much more progressive, and we're still having issues with basic education for trans individuals, accepting, and actually Miami-Dade does not have comprehensive sexual health in their public school districts. So when Ariana said it earlier too, Miami is one of the gayest cities and one of the party cities of the United States, yet their public schools don't have comprehensive sexual health. That doesn't sound right. We have a question in the comments from another advocate who is an amazing advocate here in South Florida, Tatiana Braxton. And the question Tatiana is asking is, when we're talking about those intersections of being trans, being Black, and then being forced to disclose your status, is that even necessary at this point when we have you equals you and PrEP?
I don't think it's necessary for anyone to have to be forced to share their status. That's why I think it's important to celebrate and commend when someone is strong enough to be that vulnerable and to share that experience so that we then learn from them and put it into practice. So for me, I don't think that is necessary. I don't think it's right. It's not something that I agree to.
It's so funny. Let me answer a little the question. It's so funny, right? Because what is forced enough, or what is being a forced, right? Because I think it's so important for a transgender or a person who they are activists and they talking about HIV, if they are living or they are not living, important for visibility and for advocate. That but it have to be self from yourself, right? All the time they ask me a question, why I have to disclose my status. And I say, you have to disclose your status only if you change the life of somebody or somebody change your life. That is the only way you can forge your status. But when I get my first opportunity for job, decent job, no escorting in New York, Aero.com, Craigslist, or Backpage, no. My first real job, right, was a peer. And that was a force because I was never thinking I have to be forced to say to in front of client, I am living with HIV. I think that is a process. That's what I think peers is very important program. If the peers educated with the HIV, about disclose, because in that moment I was feeling really forced to disclose my status to others when I don't want it just for a job. But after that, I understanding, and then I know how difficult it is for people. They disclose the status, so I don't think nobody have to be pushed to disclose the status. But and right now, even myself, it's so hard. But from that disclosing my status or from the HIV is where I do my professional things right now, right? This each time when I disclose my status, I representing one organization as a You Equal You or the Well Project, who monthly or who in the year financially that disclose to me, make that disclose to me. So for me, it's like a part of my life because representing income each time when I disclose my status, and that is the powerful for a transgender individual when they are thinking you by the stigmatized by something and you working and you change the work and get paying for that. People they say is a stigmatized. So for me right now I don't lose nothing. I get a lot of things, maybe it's scared, but only advice I say, you can disclose your status when you're going to change the life of somebody or somebody going to change the life for you.
I think it's very important what Jay said earlier as well about access to PrEP, for example, and being represented in those commercials. Because again, we here in South Florida, again, we have actually a lot of access compared to North Florida or even Central Florida, where Jace was saying earlier, Wilton Manors, for those who don't know, is one of the gayest cities in the United States by per capita. We have a lot of gay people living here, and so we do have a concentrated gay neighborhood like some other cities like Chicago that has Boys Town. That is a luxury that not all cities have. And so when you're saying finding a physician or someone who is attuned with transgender needs, here it's difficult. Imagine again in the panhandle of Florida. So I think it is very important as well to recognize, like Jace was saying earlier, that trans men are not gay men or women. Or it's sometimes even hard to educate our own community. I don't want to be self-hating, but I also want to talk a little bit about the stigma that exists between our own letters, right? Between the L's and the G's and the B's and the Q's. Can anyone address that?
Well, I also think when we talk about disclosure as a Black trans woman, one would assume before you became trans or before you became comfortable enough to express that this was your identity, that you were a Black gay man. And right now, Black women are leading in the numbers in HIV. So it was a thing where it came from Black gay men. And because trans women are always associated in that narrative, they don't want to come out and speak about the experience of being positive because it comes with so many negative things impacted by our own community. As you said, it's everyone's not an activist. Everyone's not an advocate. We don't all want to educate. And we can't assume because someone has a status that they are willing to share or educate folks on how to take care of them. So I just think we have to be mindful as a community and really have conversations about how to show up for those folks when they are able to come to a platform and share their narrative and experience, because it's challenging.
Well, even it not only could be challenging, but it could also put people on fear at risk of actual violence.
Absolutely.
I did want to go in. I wanted to go into, first of all, take 2 seconds to acknowledge all the lives that have been lost this year. If you are not speaking, please put yourself in mute so that, yes, thank you so much. So I don't get that feedback. Sorry. I want to acknowledge for a second again all the lives that have been lost this year due to violence against the trans community. We really have an epidemic of violence happening here in South Florida. As Ariana said before, in Puerto Rico, we are having, it is heartbreaking to me because I am Puerto Rican from the island, and seeing that my brothers and sisters there are suffering from, again, just senseless violence also makes me wonder what role HIV plays into any of this violence. There's a lot of, like you said, Brielle, you've been working with partner violence and what we would consider like domestic violence or domestic disputes, and I have seen and I have heard a lot of cases here in Florida of partners being, especially people who are immigrant and people who are trans, being forced into relationships because their partners try to dominate them and to actually control them using their HIV status as the tool and as the weapon. Because as we have said before, someone's HIV status could actually impact their social well-being, their jobs, their family. Can anyone please address that? Because I am not a transgender person, right? I'm not living that reality, but I know because I see it.
I think when you talk about marginalized people, the more marginalized you are, the easier it is for you to be vulnerable and exploited, right? So when you talk about trans being one thing, or being Black or Latinx being another thing, and then you having a HIV positive status, like it just further marginalizes you, where you are not seen as very important in society, right? So it's very easy for you to be exploited and vulnerable. So if you're an immigrant, you don't speak the language, you find a partner, and you're living with this person, it's very hard for you just to pack your stuff and leave at the first sign of abuse. Where are you going to go? We talk about trans people being underemployed. Most of us live under the poverty line, average making $10,000 a year. Where do you go? So is very, very hard trying to manage all these things and continue to be marginalized when you can't even be a productive person in society because people don't want to employ you. People
Right.
don't want to even like sit next to you. Like in my life, I'm very stealth due to survival reasons. I mean, obviously, I'm an advocate, and in certain worlds that I am out, but at my job, I'm not for various reasons of survival. And I could say that's probably one reason I haven't been underemployed. But if I were to disclose that, I think it definitely would change my interactions socially. And if I was to say, like, become HIV positive and I disclose that, that would definitely impact your social well being.
Of course. And when we think about also, you just said a huge intersection here. We have our trans brothers and sisters are not being employed already. So a lot of them have to, to go to emergency sex work. And so you have people out there working, doing sex work. And unfortunately, barebacking is, and what is considered unprotected sex is the number one request from for sex workers, believe it or not. And so we have to deal with also people who don't have access to healthcare. So there's a confusion that people have, and I have to talk about this many times, that physical changes don't make someone, they don't have to affirm an identity. Not everybody has access to those physical changes. And sometimes HIV also seeps into that process because of people looking for healthcare through other means, right? Through going through a friend to get injections, or going to a friend to get procedures that they would normally get in a healthcare setting. Ariana, I would love for you to talk a little bit about that intersection of HIV and the trans reality of needles.
Well, one of the histories about when becoming HIV positive, right, is one of the questions keeping in your head: who 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 transmit you, who give you the virus, right? And that was for many days in my life, and the time when I get becoming positive, and I was clearly in one relationship, and I was very use the protections and everything. And I wasn't sex worker at that time and everything. And one of the risks was when I have a silicone injections was on the street. And that is how important is when we're talking about sexual sexual health and transgender have to take the lead, because nobody knows what happened in between two persons and the intimate, right? Everybody assume, but they don't know what roles we are, what roles we like it, what type of guys they come in, they visiting or something. So it's so difficult. So that is so important about, as a transgender, take the lead about prevention and sexual health, because it's very difficult. And maybe people, if they don't understand as a transgender, maybe they don't understand us as a sexual life, right? Or sexual life or something, especially when a transgender woman have a relation with a trans man, or effectually when a transgender woman have a relation with other girl, or so it's that kind of intersections, and the sexual life is what is the only transgender they can understand, and they can have some guidelines, or create or developing some prevention for that kind of thing. So that's what is important. And when you're talking something about sexual survivor sex, is one of the narrative and the language in the HIV field is punishment, right? They don't talking about, even we are more in the criminalization, where transgender, they can be more persecuted and criminalized, not just because they are HIV, because they are transgender, because they are offering sex or different things. So they have a lot of labels, a lot of intersection for a transgender woman. When a transgender woman engage and sex work or survivor sex. It's too difficult to take out a transgender woman from the survivor sex when one work 8 hours in McDonald's.
I know. It is a reality that unfortunately sex work pays a lot, and especially right now with the popularity of things like OnlyFans and people really looking for those pleasures in the privacy of their home. Sex work can take many different shapes right now, and we have a comment on the section that's speaking about also trans men who are actually who are gay. And that's rarely discussed. We do know that Jace, you are straight men, but we also have a lot of trans men who do sleep with men and who are gay, and those are also at a higher risk of transmission.
And they are the real group of men have a sex with men.
They also belong in that group as well.
Yes. They have to be in that group. They're not the transgender woman. The trans men have to be in the category of men have a sex with men, right?
In Florida, actually, trans women are still sometimes identified as men who have sex with men, which is also part of this stigma issue. When you're not even recognizing and affirming someone's gender, and you're trying to categorize them as something else, or in Jace's case, a trans man, we need to have I often wonder why is the health department not making the trans information public? The trans information for STIs and HIV transmission is not public. We hear it as advocates in behind the scenes, but we don't have that information available. And I think that part of it is stigma. Brielle, we were talking about physical changes. In the work that you do as an advocate, have you seen still these physical changes taking place in places that are not healthcare settings? Do you hear about this?
First, I have to touch on what you just said and why that information isn't readily available to all of us, because I think before we can work on a solution, we have to address the problem, right? One of the most common ways to attract HIV is through sex, and we have lots of it, all of us, right? So the thing is, the conversation is never out there because this is a business, right? There's a lot of money and a lot of funding generated around the work that we do in HIV. And a lot of the times the resources and that money only goes to those who are willing to share their status. In some ways that demands folks to come out to speak about the taboo subject. So in order to address these issues, you have to go into the communities that have not engaged with HIV in that way, who have not engaged in these conversations. Those people who deem themselves negative, who still lack access to healthcare because they are just trans. So yes, and these conversations in other settings outside of the medical field or mental health, again, I don't really hear the conversations being had. The only time I hear the conversations come up is when there's HIV Awareness Day or something of that sort. We don't really talk about it, and these conversations are so necessary.
I was just going to talk about, you're right, you just mentioned funding, and we do get a lot of people interested in funding trans organizations, but it's like a one-hit wonder, right? Like we see that right now there's a lot of popularity to fund things, and yet there's no pull through. This is again my experience, where like they're not, like you're saying, they're not really coming to the communities and actually also helping people who are not identified as someone living with HIV. You do not have to be someone living with HIV to be able to access these services. If we have learned anything from COVID-19, is the fact that these disparities are affecting everyone. Not just, it does affect us, people of color, much more heavily than anybody else. But there's a lot of also white people out there who don't have access to healthcare, who don't have access to education. And they, we're still in this weird, vicious cycle of excluding people, of trying to other everybody else and to make them into something that we don't understand. I would like to speak about stigma within our own HIV community. right? We already talked about stigma within the LGBTQ community, but how does stigma work within the HIV community? Because trust me, there is. And Ariana, you travel around the country talking and meeting people. And I know that you have encountered stigma within our own movement. No names, but any experience of a stigma within our own movement that you have felt when it comes to trans and HIV?
I think what happened is people they don't believe in your talents or in the work and you produce just because you are a transgender, not just because you are HIV positive or not HIV, just because you are transgender, and the instantly you disclose yourself as a transgender, you lose as like category as a person, right? For many persons, inclusive here, inclusive in the HIV field, right? How dare you? You can talk about empower and leadership, people living with HIV when they don't funding an openly transgender living with HIV in the South who's serving more of 500 transgender living with HIV or prevention or working with trans-led agencies as a trans inclusive with Tatiana, with Morgan. How they don't empower? Because the stigma. Because people they believe I'm angry and I'm a dangerous and I'm like a trouble, right? And maybe was angry. I was angry. I was angry because I see the difference. When I working, I feel the difference. I feel the stigma when people they told me, I understand your frustration, or this is not time for you. I don't think you can do this job yet. You have to give more or something, or just because you are transgender, you have to volunteer. But I get my job, I get my salary. You volunteer because that is the kind of things I feel. And look how there happen over here in South Florida in the HIV movement and the committees right now. I don't part of any committees of the HIV here, just some with the health department and prevention and everything. But as a transgender woman living with HIV, I think that kind of services that kind of committees was monopolized for some organization. They just not looking as a person, they just looking as a business, right? And this is one of the important. But always I fight and always I get the word down because I don't focus on that stigma. I focus on allies like you, Alejandro, as the great work of Equality Florida you do in HIV right now. It's something what we have to talking about. We cannot have this opportunity, even when Equality Florida 3 years or 4 years ago. But now, when you advocacy, when you work, even we cannot transgender. We are not recognized in November 20, 5 years ago, 7 years ago, and now we have to little by little take a place, the correct place we deserve in the society as a great, amazing other leadership like Brielle, Jace, Tatiana, Morgan, all the time. People they say, oh, she's angry because she want to be only in the flashlight. No, I'm very happy when I have a more transgender in the highlights and in the flashlight, because that is what we need.
Let's talk a little bit about, first of all, I want to ask Jace. Jace, how many trans masculine organizations are there in Florida that serve specifically trans men?
None that I can think of.
Zero.
I would say we are not very centered in a lot of work. I will also say, because I think the violence towards trans women is so great, and I will never diminish that light. I think that is the large focus, right? Because the epidemic, when we talk about trans people getting murdered, largely are black femme presenting people, right? So I understand the emergency for that population, but I also see my brothers like, hey, we are here. I sat in a dinner for HIV like a presentation, and I told him about some of my concerns, about being a trans guy and how there's no information on PrEP. And he's like, we have a trans person in the commercial. And I'm like, yeah, a trans woman, not trans men. So like even your intention as a major corporation that does this work, we are still not highlighted. We asked for information about PrEP. You don't have any data. I'm not going to take any medicine that hasn't been tested on bodies like mine. Like, so when you start talking about these things, you understand the impact. And furthermore, to your point before, is like, yeah, there are trans men that do sleep with men, but there are also trans men who sleep with trans women. And so if you are a man sleeping with a woman, you identify as heterosexual.
Right.
But then they don't unpack, like Ariana was saying, like they don't unpack like sexual like positions or parts or any of that doesn't come out in conversation. And a lot of that is taboo, that, you know, if you are quote unquote bottom or you're being penetrated, then you're feminine. And you don't want to be equated with that as a trans male, most of us, that this is a further stigma. So I think it's just a lot of unpacking and a lot of conversations that still need to be had. But we're not centered in a lot of spaces. It's
Part of
more
the
so
work that we are
afterthought.
doing in Equality Florida, we
Mhm.
do have a transgender, a transgender rights and a transgender department led by the wonderful Gina Duncan, and she's been doing training for corporations to help corporations see the value of people who are from different identities. Ariana was saying that she has had to prove herself as a valuable member of our community when in her country she was a lawyer. So we think about people being dismissed. Like Ariana's also been dismissed because she's an immigrant and she might have an accent, right? I also feel that a similar to all the stigma that comes to the trans community, and how a lot of you have been tokenized. And Tatiana, I think, said it in the comments. There's a lot of organizations who want us, but they don't really want us. They want what we bring. And I say us because I include myself. Many times I have included myself in the trans community. I did drag for many years, which I know is not the same, but I struggled with my own identity when I was younger. I have friends. Actually, one of my friends is staying with Ariana right now, who were going through physical changes in my youth, and I didn't know if I wanted to be part, or if that was part of my own reality. So when we think about HIV, what are some of the things that we've talked about all these things that are wrong, and we are coming into the last 15 minutes of this conversation. And we have three very smart people here. What can we actually do? What are some of these little things that we can do to change some of that stigma that is so freaking prevalent in the trans community? I had no idea how difficult it was going to be to find speakers until I tried to find them. And I wanted all to be living with HIV. It was literally impossible to find.
Yes, because one of the like I told you, the stigma is terrible, right? And but we have a few in our group, transgender. We educate and empower to dealing with the stigma, and they openly. Mostly they are Latinas, and they have the problem with the language. But yes, but I think we have to focus on the allies and the group working agencies or foundation who there provide a belief in our work. And when I talking our work, I talking in the work of the whole transgender community, the work of Tatiana doing when trans inclusive, Morgan doing when trans social, Camille doing in empower you, and the whole transgender
We have
individual.
Ashley in Ashley just opened an organization in Central Florida, Ashley Figueroa,
Oh, you see,
she's working very hard over there in Central Florida.
so amazing, and we cannot subsist if we don't have the hands of the agencies who they already open, and they can see more of the data. They can see our life, right? As a Equality Florida, just haven't mentioned in before we closed down, we was with Equality Florida on Alejandro in Tallahassee, with close to 20 transgender individuals women of color, and mostly openly living with HIV, talking with the Congress people and people empowered to change policy. We working as a personal and with Tatiana, with Flux and with AHF, and linkage and care transgender individuals. Right now, I working with CAN and with other organizations and the health department to give PrEP services or linkage to PrEP to a transgender individuals also, or transgender people and not conforming people, right? So that is what is we focus in organization as our foundation, who they are working, Miami Foundation or AHF, as I told you. But we focus and get more funding, and people they can have more believe us and invest in us, because when they
Ariana, let me interrupt you because you have given credit to everybody but yourself. You have opened as an Ariana Center in Puerto Rico. I know that we're here to speak about Florida, but tell us a little bit about that fabulous. You were just there on a retreat with what it seemed like a lot of trans community members of Puerto Rico in the South. Tell us a little bit about the work that's happening there.
Yes, what happened is the last year I working in Puerto Rico in one project when the University of Puerto Rico and developing the first need assessment for transgender individuals in Puerto Rico. What we did over here in South Florida many years ago, or 2 years, 3 years ago, right? So we have data, we have our own data. So if people, they don't think we don't have data, we create the data. So we are allowed to have, and that is the work of a project what we have in Puerto Rico. And finally, we have, we feel the need of transgender people in Puerto Rico. So that's why we trying to keep a stay over there for the next year. And we're going to hire one person to handle it and cover the whole Puerto Rico area. And I can keep it over here and working with amazing people from Florida.
I am so happy on your selection for your representative down there in Puerto Rico. One of my very good friends, Kimberly Vasquez, who is actually in the comments as well. We are. I wanted to ask again some of these positivity, right? What are some of these things that we can or that are actually happening that we don't see that much? And Brielle and Jace, you guys just opened a new initiative, new organization. Can you guys tell us a little bit about this? Let's start with you, Jace, because you've been the most silent.
I think positive things that are happening, right? We're having these platforms that have these conversations. Like Ariana said, these conversations didn't exist years ago. Even when I started advocacy work here in South Florida, like these conversations weren't even being had. And I think the way we change stigma is to talk about it. Society, we're the ones who uphold stigma. Think about cigarettes. In the 70s and the 80s, like you could smoke and everyone thought you were cool. But now it's more of a stigma to smoke cigarettes, you know? Like most people in my generation, no shade to you, but like it's
They're horrible.
but now you hear more about, you know, how cigarette smoking is bad for you, blah 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 blah, because society has changed. Before you could smoke on airplanes and all types of stuff. Society has changed. So I think the more conversations that we have about this and the more people who can talk about these conversations openly, and, you know, I think that's how you start changing the minds of people and you start changing society, because people really don't care about things until it impacts them directly. Even look at COVID. When before people's grandmothers were dying, it was like, oh, we're still going to go out partying and to the bar. But then when it starts affecting home, then it's like, whoa, this is serious. So I think that this is important to have these conversations. And bridging the gap, it is to start centering people that aren't centered. Like you say, are there any trans masculine organizations in South Florida? No, there haven't been. And Florida, so now, yeah. Well, I'm just speaking from my experience. I don't want to negate anyone's work that might be on a panhandle or something. And like that Jay said, I don't do anything. I don't know. So I think it is to we are really focused on education in all forms and facets. Like we said, started as a book club, and education is really, I think, a key piece to equity and equality for marginalized people. The more educated we become, and then we can start to become active members of society, gaining financial equity and equality to gain access to a lot of these resources that we say we don't have.
Even just opportunities, equal opportunities
Correct.
of employment, of access.
Right.
Brielle, give us some of these good things that are happening and a little bit of that initiative that you just started.
Well, I think it's important to understand why the initiative started, right? So for me, I have contributed to stigma in many ways, just for a lack of knowledge. In my household, HIV was the thing that you didn't talk about. It was something we felt we could not impact us until a family member, was affected. So as Jay said, people don't really understand the severity of these things until they experience them close to home. For me, I lack education in so many different ways, and it was the access. So it was very important to me to create a space that was built on education, built on connecting folks to literature, and of course, being trans, not having the traditional high school experience, you got to use what you got, right? So I wanted to create a space where we could educate our folks and give them the tools necessary to thrive. So it was really important to me to have that represented in the community and in this way. So thank you. Alejandra, I just want to thank you for a moment for actually calling me in on that phone to get me to do this panel, because it's something I know I'm called to do, but I typically avoid for the reason of stigma. So I thank you for allowing me to have this dialogue. And I think it was so important and so necessary. So just thank you.
You're welcome. I really am. First of all, again, I'm very appreciative of you guys participating. And when we think about, for example, healthcare, I was actually training healthcare students, medical students not too long ago, and we had a particular student who was coming from another state, and she had never in her life ever experienced anything LGBTQ. This is a second year medical student. She was really curious on how could she get in touch? How could she get immersed in a life that was so foreign to her, coming from a religious background, living on a farm with very few people. I mean, we might think that this is, they're the exception. Actually, we do have a lot of people who lack basic education and basic exposure to LGBTQ issues. And so when you're talking about, all three of you have said the magic word that really like flags my teacher up, right, is education. And so without education and without really just going for it, we're never going to be able to get rid of this stigma. And it's having these conversations. I don't think that we're brave by coming out and saying that we're living with HIV. I think that we're finally getting comfortable with it, right? At least in my experience, it took me 6 years to come out of the HIV closet with my family. I thought I was not going to connect with my mom, my very Latino father, and it just opened so many doors in my own family that I usually try to explain that what, it might take whatever my time, but little by little we are coming out. The stigma, hopefully the inclusion and the idea of you equals you will cement itself throughout everywhere, because it took the United States longer than most countries to accept the reality of you equals you. And so I see also guys like you and people like you, right? Ariana, I see Brielle, I see Jace, and to be honest, many years ago we might have had a lot of advocates, but there were few, and they're only seen in these big events and these big protests. And the work behind the scenes is now happening in front of the scenes. I see Ariana having her cafecito with Ariana Center weekly and talking about these conversations is so important. We only have 5 minutes left, and I want to leave, again, things in a positive way, no pun intended. But there you go, Ariana. I want you guys to give us one last, I don't know, message to people out there who don't really understand HIV and stigma. If you can just give us one last statement about this conversation, what do you want people to live with Ariana, we're going to start with you. We're going to continue with Brielle, and then we're going to do Mr. Jace.
Bueno, voy a hablar en español, cosa que los otros hablan
Vale.
en inglés y así estamos completitos, ¿verdad? So I'm going to talk in Spanish. I'm going to say my last words in Spanish. So, yo creo que lo más importante es que tener conciencia, sobre todo de la importancia del estigma y la importancia de que tú seas parte de romper el estigma con el VIH. No importa tu estatus, ¿verdad? En mi caso, pues obvio, yo importa mi estatus, pero en el caso es defender los derechos y tratar de tener en mejor calidad acceso a salud pública, a tener tu vida controlada y tener saludable es importante. Yo creo que eso es lo más importante que debemos saber sobre el estigma, que el estigma se rompe solamente con educación y con que tú seas no parte del problema, sino parte de la solución.
Ariana, gracias una vez más por estar con nosotros. Sabes que te adoro. Thank you so much, Ariana, for that message in Spanish. We're now going to switch it up to English, and we're going to leave with this last statement from Brielle. Brielle, after this conversation, what's your message, in terms of HIV stigma?
For me, I just believe that education is powerful, right? And wisdom comes with knowledge, and wisdom is a gift. It comes with an experience. So while we are continuously educating ourselves, educate those that you know and love who are largely affected, because representation matters. So yeah, educate each other, support one another, love one another.
Thank you so much,
That's my
Brielle.
message.
And Jace, my man, you got the last word.
So I would say stand in those gaps. Everyone doesn't have to be an activist or advocate, but in your own little way, you can be an advocate, right? Start by having small conversations with people you care about. Have conversations at your dinner tables, at your Thanksgiving tables. I know I use my inherited male privilege to have these conversations with cis heterosexual males, largely my brother, about HIV stigma. So take just a little piece of your life and educate others. And this is the only way that we eradicate stigma around anything, really, is to have these difficult conversations and just start smaller and smaller. It doesn't have to be this great act, doesn't have to be this huge thing, and you don't have to bring it up every Christmas and Thanksgiving. I'm not saying that, but just start having these small conversations so we can eradicate fears and stigma.
I hope that next time that we do one of these, when we're talking about stigma, we can have all of our panelists be living with HIV proud and out. And I want to thank you guys again for showing up this evening. We have tomorrow, we will be back with another conversation on stigma and the Black and Latinx disparities. We kind of went through it a little bit here today, but tomorrow we're going to dive deep with our panel of guest speakers. We have Emilio Aponte, who is a great advocate from South Florida. We have Maria Mejia, who is a national and international advocate from the Well Project. We also have Daniel Downer from Central Florida, who is another amazing advocate in the Black community. And we also will have Alicia Trammell from South Florida, who is, again, one of my favorites. And we're going to have a robust conversation about how stigma really seeps itself again in these communities. And I am so tired of listening to we're all, Latinos and Blacks are we're the brunt, we're taking the brunt of the disease. Yes, we are. And it's time to stop that. And the only way that we're going to do it, as you all have said, is to be open, is to have education, and is to educate others. So that is my last message for tonight. I really want to thank everyone who joined us, especially my guest speakers and everyone who took a little bit of your time. If you can, share this. Don't be afraid of speaking about HIV. Get tested. And remember that trans brothers and sisters are just the same as you. They just think a little and are just a little different. That's all. Thank you, everyone.